is with Joe Kilgore. Joe is the author of over 20 short stories and 4 novels. His short stories have been published in magazines, creative journals, anthologies, and online literary publications. Before turning to fiction, he had a long and successful career with international advertising agency Ogilvy and Mather.
Either way.
Does it matter? In addition to his fiction, Joe writes for Austin advertising firm Bazzirk Inc. and also serves as a professional book reviewer. He lives in Lakeway with his wife, Claudia, an accomplished artist. Joe.
That's Bazzirk, by the way. Kirk would get after me if I didn't let everyone know that. Thank you very much for coming out. It's great to have an audience that you can actually see sometimes, and not just out there someplace. Oddly enough, we have 2 Kirks here tonight. We have a Kirk on this side of the room and a Kirk on this side of the room. One of the Kirks said to me, "Well, if your book takes place in France, maybe you should open up by singing La Vie en Rose or something." You'll be happy to know I'm not going to do that. The other Kirk said, "Well, why don't you just tell some sort of literary joke or something?" I said, "Well, I only know one literary joke, and that's Ernest Hemingway was once asked, 'Why does the chicken cross the road?' And Hemingway's answer was, 'To die alone in the rain.'" So, that's for Hemingway. As relates to the book I've written, entitled Farmhouse in the Rain, it's a novel that takes place in the mid-40s and early 50s, during and after World War II. There's a mystery at the heart of it. There is a murder mystery that is sort of the axis that the whole thing turns on. But the novel is really about people, both on the battlefield and the home front, and sort of the lives they were living and what they were going through during the course of the war. We focus basically on 3 soldiers, 3 American soldiers, and the women they love and the women that love them. And we sort of follow them as these things occur. At one point in the novel, they are separated from their unit, and they are put up for the night by a French partisan, a lady who's good to them and helps them out, and they take shelter in her place for the night. The next morning, she is found dead, and they realized they were the only 3 in the room. And throughout the novel, eventually you find out what occurred and who was involved and who wasn't. The novel begins by sort of introducing these 3 characters, one from Texas, one from Chicago, and one from Los Angeles. Very different backgrounds. The little piece I'll read from you tonight is part of the introduction of the young soldier from Chicago prior to his getting into the service. You know, a lot of people don't realize that in World War II, the need for young men was so great that actually 2/3 of the people who went into the service during that period were drafted, and were not volunteers. 1/3 of the force was volunteers, and 2/3 were draftees. So everybody kind of came into it from a different point of view. But the piece I'm going to take you through tonight is basically sort of the young man's situation before he gets involved in the service, and you may come to understand a little bit of why he does. So it's 1942, it's winter in Chicago, and it begins. Pardon me. By 9 o'clock that night, the snow had begun to fall even harder. Brendan stood on the corner of 87th Street and Stony Island Avenue beneath a green canvas awning now cupcaked with a layer of white. He had gone home for dinner, told his parents he was going out to shoot pool with his friends, and now he stood rocking from one foot to the other with a cigarette dangling from his lips while his hands remained stuffed in his pockets to ward off the cold. Keeping his eyes peeled for Ian's 1939 DeSoto, Brendan didn't immediately notice the street waif, who rounded the corner and walked up beside him. A tug on his pant leg got his attention. "Flowers, mister? Want to buy some flowers?" "Hey, it's kind of late for a kid like you to be out, ain't it? Shouldn't you be home by now?" "My mom says I have to sell all my flowers before I come home." "Well, I can't buy any tonight, sweetheart, but I tell you what, if you're here tomorrow, earlier, say around 7, I'll buy all the flowers you've got." "Honest, you will, mister?" "I said it. I'll do it. And you know, there's a hospital just a few blocks from here. Why don't you head over? I bet a lot of people will want to buy flowers there. For the people who are sick." "That's right. Yeah, you can sell them there." She took off down the sidewalk, through the drifting snow, shouting without turning back, "See you there tomorrow, mister, at 7. I'll be here." 10 minutes later, the black DeSoto pulled up. Ian was behind the wheel and Snapper was in the back seat. Snapper Dooley was a mental deficient who made up for his lack of intelligence with an abundance of meanness. Growing up, he spent most of his time in and out of reform schools. He would have gotten into even more trouble than he did were it not for Ian Donovan. Ian's misspent youth was no less checkered than Snapper's, but Ian was smarter and infinitely more cunning. He used people like rungs on a ladder, and he always found ways for someone other than himself to take the fall for whatever nefarious endeavor he was engaged in. But he had a knack for endearing himself to others before his true colors unfurled. That's how he had pulled Brendan into his orbit. On the surface, he seemed like a sharp operator who really knew the score, plus what corners to cut without getting into trouble he couldn't get out of. But Brendan was about to find out that the surface was a lot slicker than he realized. "I'll slide over, and you drive from here," Ian told Brendan. 5 minutes after that, all three were sitting in the car across the street from Feldman's. So far, Brendan thought everything was going according to plan. But so far only goes so far. "Okay, it's almost 9:30, Ian said. "Now, when Feldman comes out, if he's not carrying any sort of satchel or package, that means the week's take is still inside. But if he's got something under his arm, just drive up ahead of him. Snapper and I will jump out, shove him in the alley, and take it from him there." Brendan's response was instantaneous. "What? What are you talking about? You didn't say anything about jumping anybody on the street. You said he always leaves the take inside." "Well, if he doesn't, my lad, we've got to be prepared to adjust. Look, this isn't what we talked about. You said all I had to do was sit in the car and wait. You said I should hit the horn if a patrolman got too nosy and pick you guys up in the back entrance 5 minutes after you went in. You said that's all I had to do." Snapper piped up from the back seat. "Not going all weak knees on us, are you, boy? It's not what we talked about. It's not what I agreed to." "Agreements be damned," Ian said. "You heard what to do if he comes out with something under his arm." "But Feldman's an old guy," Brendan replied. If he struggles or resists, he could wind up getting hurt. "I never agreed to be part of hurting anybody." "Oh, I doubt very seriously that he'll be resisting," Snapper said, pulling a revolver from his coat pocket. "You brought a gun?" Brendan couldn't believe it. "Look, breaking and entering is one thing. Armed robbery is something else. This is crazy. I'm not going to be part of..." "Look," Ian said, pointing across the street and cutting off Brendan's protests. The light inside Feldman's were going out. Any moment now, the old man would be stepping out and locking the door. Snow continued to fall. The temperature continued to drop. But Brendan had broken a sweat that rimmed his collar, beaded on his forehead, and wet the tip of his upper lip. "Don't have anything with you," he said silently to himself. "Leave it inside. Don't be carrying anything, please." The door swung open. Feldman stepped outside. He was wearing a fedora and a big brown overcoat. It took him a second to find his keys and lock the door because he had to take the big manila package he was carrying and put it under his arm. "Start the car," Ian said. "But look," then he felt, pardon me. "But look," Brendan said. But then he felt the cold muzzle of a revolver pressed against his neck. "Start the car." The engine turned over as Ian said, "Start off slowly, let him get almost to the corner, then cut in front of him quickly so he can't cross." Brendan pulled away from the curb and started down the street. How had he gotten himself into this? He knew the answer. It was another shortcut, another way to get money without really working for it. But it was all going to go wrong. He could just feel it. Feldman was getting closer to the corner. "All right, get ready to hit it," Ian said. "Now." Brendan stomped the gas pedal and cut the steering wheel sharply to the left, sliding Ian's snapper to the right side of the car. But just as he was coming to an abrupt halt in front of Feldman, he knew he didn't want to be part of what might happen. With no thought of the consequences, he whipped the wheel back to the right and hit the pedal again. The speed of the thrust and the icy streets caused the DeSoto to fishtail. In the panic to straighten the car but get away from Feldman, Brendan jerked the wheel again. But the overcorrection on the slick pavement sent the car into a spin. Centrifugal force took over as the coupe spun like a top down the middle of the street, barely missing the parked cars on both sides. Then the tires hit the curb, jolting the front of the vehicle up and bouncing it onto the sidewalk. When the wheels came down with a thump, Brendan could swear they barely preceded a muffled cry. By the time Ian and Snapper had climbed up from the floorboards and made sure they were in one piece, Brendan had opened the driver's door and stepped out into the street. The first things he saw were crimson rose petals scattered over white snow. "Get back in the car," Ian yelled. "We can catch up with Feldman in the next block." But Brendan didn't respond. His gaze was now fixed on the little girl lying in a heap against the side of a building. "We hit her," Brendan said, almost too softly to be heard. "We didn't hit her. You hit her," Snapper said. Ian yelled, "Get back in the car." By now, Brendan was on the sidewalk, leaning over her. "We have to help. She's breathing. You help her, altar boy. She's your problem." But not a word about us," Ian threatened. "Not a word about us if you know what's good for you. This is all your fault anyway." With that, Ian slid behind the wheel. Snapper joined him in the front seat, and the DeSoto backed off the curb and drove away into the black Chicago night. An hour later, on the third floor of Mercy Hospital, a patrolman who had recently stepped out of the elevator was wrapping up a conversation with the duty nurse. The last thing he asked was, "Who brought her in?" "That young man sitting over there on the bench," she replied. The policeman walked over, put his hand on Brendan's shoulder. It startled him out of an exhausted sleep. The first thing out of his mouth was, "Is she going to be okay, officer?" "No, son, I'm afraid she's not going to be okay," the policeman answered. "Now suppose you tell me exactly what happened." Brendan couldn't believe it. He felt sick inside. He knew it was an accident, knew that the car was out of control, knew he had never seen her there. But when he spoke, words just started pouring out, words that were far from the truth. I don't really know. I was on the next street over. I heard some tires squealing, and when I turned the corner, there she was. I picked her up and carried her here to the hospital." "The night nurse confirms you brought her in, son," the policeman said. "But now that you told me what you told me, it might interest you to know that Seamus McElwain has a newsstand near the very corner, and he witnessed the whole thing. You better come with me." So, that's a piece from it turns out that Brendan is brought up on manslaughter charges, and as was often the rule of the day back then, when plea bargains were perhaps not as great as they are today, he was given the choice of going to trial and letting the jury decide his fate, or enlisting in the Army, because the Army needed a lot of men. And that's how he got into the service to begin the story. And as I said, we follow each man, we follow the axis that the book turns on, and we also learn a lot more about the people who are on the home front while they are off on the battlefront, and what happens when they all come back together. So that's A Farmhouse in the Rain.
Excellent.
Becky suggested that if anyone had any questions, I would have to answer them, not her. If anyone has any questions, oh, yes, ma'am?
How did you come by the name?
Oh, A Farmhouse in the Rain.
Yes.
Well, I came by it after going through about 50 other titles, I guess. I sort of like the idea. It had a literary feel to it. I like the idea of using the locale of where the sort of main event of the book happens. Even though it's rather blind, it doesn't explain much about what's in the book. But it starts out that but I chose it, I guess, for its sound as much as for its meaning. One of the first titles that I had on the book for a long time was When Last We Were Heroes, which I kind of like too, because I had this feeling. I mentioned to someone before we were talking that writing about this period, I sort of felt like that was one of the last times in American history up to this point that everyone was more or less on the same page. Everyone more or less believed this was one battle or one war that ought to be fought. Not everyone, of course, it's never the case, but certainly not since then, I think, have much of any of us been on the same page. So I thought it was an interesting time to explore, and it was fun to do.
What drew you to that period and to that particular story?
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. I've always liked looking back more than looking forward. I don't know why. You know, it's I'm not a big science fiction fan because I always feel like it's too easy. Because no matter what happens, you find out that the hero had a second heart or a third brain or whatever, and he was really from Alluvian 1, you know, and he could take care of it. So you make it up. So I don't know. In the works that I write, I try to keep it as realistic as possible, and as you know, built around times that a lot of us went through. I mean, some of us, you know, are of that age, but even those who aren't, I think, are interested in that time period and whatnot. And I tried to keep most of the events that are chronicled in the different places in the same way. I just read a novel recently called The Film. It's also about World War II. But the whole literary conceit of the book is that what might have happened if Germany had occupied Great Britain and not some of the other places that they did. And those of you who a few years ago saw the Quentin Tarantino movie, Inglourious Bastards. Well, in that movie, he puts Hitler and the rest of the gang in a theater and burns them all up. You know, but to me, those things just kind of feel too easy to me. I would rather explore, you know, things that might have actually gone on and things that could have actually happened as opposed to what did.
So did writing the book change your idea of that period in any way? Did you learn something that you unexpected?
Well, like I said, while I said that almost everyone was on the same page, that was true. But there were a lot of reasons that other people weren't on that page. In the story, the young man from Los Angeles, his father works for the relocation authority, taking Japanese people and relocating them to places in Arizona and other parts of the country. And also his wife, the young man's mother, the wife of the fellow I'm talking about, was very anti-Roosevelt, and so it was always Mr. Roosevelt's war, as opposed to, you know, this or that war or whatever. So it was interesting to see it. And as I said, the point about 2/3 of the soldiers being draftees as opposed to enlistees. A lot of times people look back on that age now and just assume, well, everybody ran out the door the minute Pearl Harbor happened and signed up, you know. But that wasn't the case at all. In fact, they had to do an awful lot to make sure they had the manpower they needed. So different things like that were some of the things perhaps I didn't know. I don't know that it changed any feelings I had overall about the period. I've always looked on it. I take I absolutely take Tom Brokaw's line for granted. He refers to the people who lived that whole time as our greatest generation, and I think that's probably true. Probably is. Yowza.
Is there a moment or moments in the book that resonate with you personally in particular?
Well, yeah. There's the three men become paratroopers, and I go through the whole training thing with it. Not only basic training and advanced infantry training, but also parachute training. I went through parachute training myself. In fact, literally, people find this hard to believe. The first 5 times I was ever in an airplane, I got to the ground before the plane did. In fact, the first time I was able to actually land in the same plane I left in, I thought that was great. You know? That was terrific. So there is a good bit in the book about the fellows training and whatnot, and a lot of that, the jump sequences and whatnot, a lot of that is what I experienced and picked up through that. You know, so. Well, thank you all very much. Wait. Somebody said.
So, what authors do you really admire and perhaps have influenced your style in how you write?
Well, the two that, there are actually 2 books that I would like to think this book is sort of in the lineage of. One was Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, and the other was Irwin Shaw's The Young Lions, both about young men in battle and things that were going on in the home front of World War II. My favorite authors tend to all be dead. Graham Greene, the British novelist, is almost my favorite, I guess, and Raymond Chandler, the great creator of Philip Marlowe and whatnot, is another as well. Patricia Highsmith, born in Fort Worth, as a matter of fact, I really like her work, The Talented Mr. Ripley and Strangers on a Train. A lot of people don't realize that she actually wrote Strangers on a Train, and Hitchcock wound up making this great film of it. People who are, the ones who are alive, I guess, like all Texans who read, I guess, Cormac McCarthy, you know, is big. There's a fellow, I don't know how many people read, that is just a great writer, Pete Dexter. Pete Dexter wrote Paris Trout and won the National Book Award. I forget what year, it's been a number of years ago from that. He also was the original author of Deadwood, that they made the miniseries from. Yeah, he's a writer from Philadelphia, and he was a newspaper columnist for a long time. And then he began writing novels and whatnot. So if you ever see anything by Pete Dexter, believe me, it's worth reading. In fact, one of his books that's not a novel is called Paper Trails, and it's literally a grouping of his columns. And you absolutely, I remember one time I was reading this at home, Claudia was walking through the house, and she kept looking over at me, and I literally was bursting out laughing one moment, and then wiping tears out of my eyes the next. I mean, he's really excellent. Pete Dexter, he's getting a lot older now too, and he hasn't written a book. I guess his last book was called Spooner, which was 5-6 years ago, maybe something like that. But so those are some of the ones that I.
What about Woolley?
Who?
Woolley.
That's I forgot about
And his
that.
cat, Cornell
Very good, yeah. I left out another great dead author. Cornell Woolrich wrote in the late 30s and early 40s, mostly mysteries and detective novels and that sort of thing like that. He was a very, very strange fellow. He lived in New York all his life. Most of his life he lived with his mother. He was a tiny little guy. I think when he died, he was like, 80-something pounds or something like this. But when he was working, and at least up until the 50s or 60s, he had more books and stories that had been turned into films than anyone else. He wrote under his name, Cornell Woolrich, and also under other pseudonyms. But movies like Hitchcock's Rear Window, wow, and Rendezvous in Black, and there's one after another. So if you ever see his name knocked about anywhere or see anything from him, you can generally find him in really interesting stories like this, or in half-price books locked up on the shelf somewhere or something like that. But yeah, he's great, Cornell Woolrich. he got so obsessed in his writing often that he wouldn't take care of himself. And he got diabetes, and because he didn't change his shoes often enough, he wound up having his foot amputated because he was just so obsessive about everything that he was doing. And his work is really good. Excellent writer, and a lot of people have said the biggest hang-up people have about him is that the plots are too coincidental. Too many things happen, they say, in the plot. Say, well, it wouldn't really happen that way, you know. But he writes so well, and there's always some sort of mystery or some sort of interesting thing that you find out in there that it doesn't bother you. You know, if you like good writing, it really doesn't bother you. He's a great writer. Okay. Oh wait, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to ask why you became a writer.
I'm sorry.
Why did you become a writer?
Why did I become a writer? Because I could do it, I guess. And I mean, it's one of the things that I guess from an early age, I thought I could do it well. So I just sort of kept doing it, you know. And then all of a sudden, people actually started paying me to do it. So I said, wow, well, that must be something, you know, worthwhile. But I don't know that it was any great urge to create or anything like that. I just enjoy doing it. Now, at this age, like with this book and a couple of the others that I've done, when people ask, well, why did you do that particular book or whatnot? What caused you to write that? Frankly, it was because I couldn't find one to read that I really liked, you know? So I said, I'm gonna set out to write something that I'd really like to read, you know? And that's sort of what led to this book and a couple of the others as well. But it was more a decision than a compunction.
No.
I have one question.
Yes, ma'am.
Going back to your comment that you think that this was the greatest generation, you hear that a lot. Why do you think it was? What specifically, like you said,
Yeah.
a lot more people they didn't sign up, they were drafted. So what were the characteristics that you think that made that the greatest generation?
Well, I think generationally, there had never been a time where the world, and therefore the United States, was faced with such a challenge before. I mean, sure, there's terrorism today. Sure, things go on today, you know, bits of problems here and there. But, you know, there was a moment there where the world was going to completely change. If Germany had gone on to win the war and be successful, everything that they had known up to that point would be different, and probably everything that we know now would certainly be different. But I think the way that they all seemed to rise to the occasion, whether they were drafted, whether they entered or not. They all fought. The people who were home then did all of the things. You know, there's one story after another of what people did at home, victory gardens and women going into the workplace that had never been in a workplace before. And they weren't going into it just because they wanted to work. They were going into it to help the war effort. So the war was such a huge part of that time, and the effort, I guess, was so great, and so across the board, so many people involved in it. And I guess that's why, you know. And as I say, these days it just becomes harder and harder to find things that everybody sort of agrees we ought to take part in and we ought to do. That there's almost nothing today that there isn't two different competing or opposing sides to, you know. So maybe that whole feeling of togetherness and doing something that ought to be done collectively is part of it as well.
Don't you think after 9/11 that the United States, I think, was ready to do that? That the government said, to rally around and help the war effort, one should go shopping. So sometimes it's the time. It's not just the people.
Mhm.
I mean, I think that sometimes the time dictates the people, or you get an opportunity. Was it Kennedy said, "Why were you a hero?" And they said they sunk my boat. So sometimes
Right.
it's the circumstances.
No, absolutely, and how you respond to something. I mean, adversity always pops up, and different people respond in different ways. And how individuals respond and how we respond collectively, you know, I think is part of it too. But back then, there was no, there was no going shopping. It was pitch in and get it done.
Yeah, my mother served, she was the first lieutenant.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
But it just worries me that the greatest generation is basically almost all dead.
Worries us too.
So, and I just don't think that, and as a writer, and it's true, I think this war is written about far more than any of the other wars
Mhm.
that the United States has participated in. And I think that the fundamental character of Americans is still very strong.
Yeah. Well, everyone's going to have a different opinion about it. And, today, the opinions will be very different than they are 10 years in the future. Everything changes. People change, cultures change, technology changes, almost everything too. So the fact that they are looked upon as the greatest generation doesn't mean they were the only great generation. It doesn't mean perhaps in the future they might be as great as another generation to come. It's just I think people take a look now and say to themselves, of the generations I'm aware of, perhaps my mother-in-law's is that greatest generation, who, by the way, just celebrated day before yesterday her 94th birthday.
Let's eat food, and you can buy books, and Joe will sign it.
Thank you.